Something a little different in North Carolina than some other states was the state board was the authorizing body.
And the only authorizing body.
Exactly. So, and I think the speaker discusses later in his interview that that was by design because if it was left to the school districts, charters just wouldn't get off the ground.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom, powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Welcome back, friends, to the Bold by Choice podcast. I'm your host, Vashanta Harris, and in our last episode, we explored how bold leadership in Michigan and Florida really helped to spread the charter school idea beyond Minnesota. But the movement definitely didn't stop there. These are examples of laws passing across the states. Now, we won't talk about every state in detail, but we will highlight some examples. Now, if you'd like to see a timeline for when all of the states that have charter laws were able to pass them, I invite you to check out our friend Ember Reichgott-Young's book, Zero Chance of Passage. Also, visit the Founders Library at founderslibrary.org, and the show notes will have links there for where you can find all of these resources. Now, we're going to start by heading west to Arizona and then south to North Carolina. Two states, two very different contexts, but each said yes to chartering and did it in their own way. So we're going to explore what made that possible. In Arizona, leaders pushed for some radical independence, creating an entirely new kind of board to authorize the schools. And North Carolina, the idea found traction through more conservative leadership and a hunger for school choice. So this episode is going to bring you some voices from both of those states. We'll hear how the politics, the values, and the vision shaped two more versions of the charter promise.
Bashana, I love how you teed that up because chartering is a promise. It's not a policy or a process, as we like to say. And so the story and the compare contrast between Arizona and North Carolina is a great one. Arizona was often referred to in the early days as the Wild West. And yet what we now see 30 years later is that they truly were a leader in creating an educational marketplace that parents and students and educators have come to embrace and adopt and love. And now people are making the trek to Arizona to be like, how did you do this? What are you doing? Why is it so dynamic? How do we get some of that here? And we've seen some of the talent and the organizations coming out of Arizona and helping influence other parts of the country. And so then you go to North Carolina. Boy, talk about a state that's growing, robust, dynamic, and they've got a different model. And the way they got there is a bit different as well through their leadership in the legislature and founders making things happen. So we're going to dig into both of those stories. We're going to share some great stuff from the Founders Library, which is a resource to the movement. And we also got our friend and colleague Don Cooper with us, and we will talk a little bit behind the scenes of some of the political machinations and how they made this happen.
All right. Well, friends, we're going to start by hearing from Lisa Graham Keegan. Let's check out this clip.
Your involvement in the passage of the law?
Well, by the time it passed, I was the chairman of the Education Committee. It had been a years-long effort with a lot of public support by something called the Arizona Business Leaders for Education and by Chicano por la Causa, which was Tommy Espinoza at the time. It had gone on for a while, ultimately passed the whole Reform Act in a special session in 1994. That depended on a couple of things. Number one, charter law was part of that effort and had been really owing to Tom Patterson, who had been trying to pass that law by itself for a while. The major reform piece was run in the Senate by Hispanic Democrats, primarily Linda Aguirre, and through Governor Symington's office by Armando Ruiz, who had been in the legislature, was a massive school choice advocate, continues to be. And he really drove the coalition with ABLE and CPLC. Ultimately, the bill died as a bill. It had in it free open enrollment, It had public charter schools, it had report cards, but it also had a little pilot for 1,500 students or a voucher. And that was objectionable. That died by one vote, 3:00 in the morning in the Senate. We came back a couple of weeks later in a special session, took the vouchers out, passed the whole thing. I'm really critically important to recognize the role that Tom Patterson had played over a number of years and Hispanic Coalition led by Democrats played. There are no charter schools in Arizona without that whole coalition.
You were then elected state school superintendent from 1995 to 2001. What was your role in chartering at that time, and what were your expectations for chartering?
Well, the law required us to have applications for public charter schools in place by 1995. And we did that through the State Board of Ed, through TRIP application, and the State Board for Charter Schools. Ultimately, most of the charters have, or almost all, have moved over to the State Board for Charter Schools. But there were two boards, and they were sort of competitive in the way they approached this. We did put it together so that we could have applications by 95. And my belief continues to be the purpose is to allow expert educators to bring their talents to families, to bring their talents to students. And we absolutely insisted on allowing for what we didn't yet understand. Arizona was the fourth state to have public charter schools, the first in the country to have a board dedicated to approving, overseeing public charter schools. There wasn't a lot of knowledge about what this would look like. I felt the most important thing was to allow it, to oversee so that they were safe and they were legal and there wasn't fraud, et cetera. But that we absolutely would allow success where failure had reigned. And that sometimes takes a long time, and you have to be willing to let these things happen. You let the process teach you. That was an honor, and it was rough and it was wild, which I think that's important when you're inventing something. Really importantly, not to impose what you think is a perfect model and to let these models come. And Arizona insisted on that.
The Arizona State Board for Charter Schools was established in 95. As you indicated, students at Catherine Kilroy was first executive director. Is that correct?
I think she was, yes. So we had the state board taking applications, and we had the state board for charter school. So Catherine had been in the department a long time. And we needed somebody who understood that process, and she did a good job.
And you mentioned, that, things were somewhat rough at the start of chartering, and there were several obstacles. The legislation was light on those details, but we did have applicants with and without much experience starting to submit applications. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it would be impossible to have experience being a charter school operator in 1994 unless you were in Minnesota or California or Colorado. So it was going to be new. As to whether you'd ever run a school or not, you would have had to have either run a private school or come out of the public school sector as a school leader. And of course, that's difficult. We knew we would have to put up as much infrastructure financially as we could. We did things like meeting with Standard & Poor's and the banks, explaining to them what charter schools are meant to be, that they needed money, and that they have to be able to loan the money in the private sector. And then there were, of course, grants. We did not, at that time in 94, we did not test every student every year, starting at third grade, as we do now. Well, we did have assessments, and schools were, of course, had to take all of those. It was just a different time. And again, our biggest emphasis was to try to get past failure, particularly for low-income students. And we learned a lot of things over time about what it takes. I'm grateful that Arizona continues to have primarily a mindset to allow these things to happen where they can prove there's a promise of excellence. So yeah, it had to be rocky, and I think I'm grateful I'm me, and I don't mind rocky. Chaos in the beginning of any enterprise is okay. You have to let the process teach you. If you're convinced you know how it should be, you prevent a lot of really excellent things from happening.
So before we truly dig in here, Don, I'd like to come to you first and ask if you can share some context with us about what was going on in the mid 1990s that made the environment really ripe for passing of charter laws across the states.
Great question, Vashanta. And again, we kind of got to rewind all the way back to A Nation at Risk. So that report set off a national imperative to improve the quality of our schools, and that, it didn't just end in the 80s. It didn't end with some of the work that Al Shanker and Ted Coldry and others were doing, but it came into the presidential campaign in 1992. So both President Bush and his challenger, Bill Clinton, made education a central theme of their platforms in 1992. President Bush, part of his was a choice-based program that he called the GI Bill for Students. We'd know it today as vouchers. President Clinton, then candidate Clinton, was searching for the third way, and we know that today as chartering. So once chartering took off in Minnesota, you had this national environment that was just ripe for change. It was on the national agenda. School reform was being talked about in states across the nation. And with Minnesota's passage in 1991 and California's passage in 1992, a handful of states, including my home state of Michigan, Colorado, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin, followed suit after. And it really started showing that the charter idea was ripe to be put into law. Also at that same time, Jim, one of your good friends, was starting her critical and impactful work throughout the nation, Jeannie Allen over at the Center for Education Reform. She was just starting her work back in 1993, and her work was just critical to spreading the charter idea and pro-reform ideas throughout the nation.
Oh, Jeannie's one of the greatest champions of educational freedom there's ever been. And I remember being a grad student reading the Center for Education Reform newsletter. And I think at the time it came in the mail once a month. Boy, Jeannie's a legend, and she's somebody we've got to get on the show.
And another legend in chartering was who we just heard from, Lisa Graham Keegan. Jim, I think she's a Hall of Fame inductee with you as well, maybe a little bit of a different year, but she's someone who stayed with the chartering idea from idea to policy through implementation. Before she was state superintendent, she was a two-term state representative, chair of the Education Committee, and as she described, helped shepherd the charter legislation through, and then was in the very rare spot to be in a spot where she was able to implement it during her time as state superintendent, too. So she really knew the policy, she knew what was trying to be accomplished, and was able to put the systems and procedures in place to allow for Arizona to accomplish what it did.
Don, I'm so glad you highlighted that. And Vashanta, let's dig into that for a minute. In previous episodes, we've talked about policy entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about John Engler from Michigan as a policy entrepreneur and some others. Lisa Graham Keegan absolutely has the characteristics of a policy entrepreneur. And she helped make policy as a lawmaker. She helped implement policy as the state superintendent. But did you also hear her mindset?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to be rocky. I'm going to use my words, failed forward. We learned, we iterated. And I love her quote of, it would be impossible to be an experienced charter school operator in 1993, 1994.
Right.
And I think that's just such sage wisdom for leaders today that are listening to this podcast. When you're doing new and different, there isn't a body of research. And so what are you betting on? You're betting on people, you're betting on track records, but you're also stewards of possibility. What could become if? And how do we keep kids safe, but how do we try new things when there has to be a better way? And that's part of the promise of chartering. We can do better.
That's right. And what I love about when I think about policy entrepreneurs is it means they all in their own way were going about this new thing. And what that means, though, is there were some interesting characteristics in the typical laws that were passed at that time because they weren't all the same. And let's dig into that. What do you all see as some of those different characteristics in the typical charter laws that were being passed in the 1990s?
So I want to just stay on Lisa Graham Keegan for a minute, because what she said is she didn't do this by herself, right? She talked about lawmakers. She talked about the business community. She talked about the Hispanic coalition. She talked about Democrats and Republicans, what we'd call bipartisanship. They built a coalition of people that believed there was a better way for kids. And I think that is one of the common characteristics across these laws. That's why we call it the National Charter School Founders Library. There were these people that had visions that we call founders who took action to make stuff happen.
Yeah, Jim, I think that's right. I think that's just a big overarching theme that we've seen throughout the charter movement and throughout the passage of successful education reform laws in general, is it really takes a team, a coalition, and a group of people who are willing to stay with it for a long time in order to make this work. Some of the things that Lisa didn't talk about are probably equally as fascinating. So she shared about the people who were involved in the passage of the law, but when she was state superintendent, she was in a position where she could start marshaling some power, some resources, some financial resources, all of the things that are necessary to put the systems in place and put the applications in place for the first group of charters to be granted. And as she said very humbly, she was tasked with that in state law of having it up by 1995. And that's a really big lift. And there are probably some really interesting things that happen behind the scenes that maybe at some point, if Lisa wants to join our show, she can share with us.
We should absolutely do that. And Jeannie and Lisa were like, they were forces together. You talk about two strong women leaders that made things happen. You combine those two, and they made so much happen, not only in Arizona, but across the country. But a couple things I want to highlight about Lisa, too. So she talked about two authorizers, the State Board of Education and the State Charter School Board for Education. And she talked that they kind of competed against each other. Well, what's cool about that is we often think of charters as, charter schools competing against district schools. Well, why not a little competition amongst authorizers? Why not different paths, different ways, different possibilities? And I think that's a rich part of the Arizona story. I think the other thing is she said, look, we went out and we talked to Standard & Poor's, we talked to banks, we talked to financiers, we talked to people that design and build facilities. We found grants. Like, that is such a cool part of the story because we often go back to Coldery, create the conditions where excellence can thrive. That's what they did. And so, Don, as you always point out, there's passing a law, but laws don't create schools. You got to get it implemented. And this is an example of how those policy entrepreneurs never quit. They lose, but they fail forward, right? And it might be on legislation, it might be on a pathway to implementation, it might be a funding source, but they're relentless in the quest of what I like to call the North Star, making education work better for kids and families.
That's right. Before we move on, I'd love to hit one more question. How did Arizona's approach set it apart from some of the other early adopter states?
Great question. And I think one big difference between Arizona and other adopters was the state charter school board. So as Jim said, and as Lisa said, this was a first of its type in the nation to have an independent authorizing body, something that was set up specifically for charters. That's really important because the other educational agencies that were tasked with chartering and other laws all existed beforehand. So school districts and state boards of education, state departments, universities. So they already had a mission. They already had capacity. They already had focus on certain things. So being able to start new and have an entity that's just laser-like focused on charters, and that's their sole mission, I think is a really important reason why Arizona was able to grow to the point that it has in the school choice world. The second thing that comes through for those who listen to the full interview is Arizona had just a very unique approach, different approach than other states. So in Minnesota, sometimes you'll hear Ted and others, and I've said it before, talk about the lab school concept. We're going to try something different. So a group of teachers where there's something that's kind of proven, but you want to do a little more of it. Michigan, Florida gets more into the competitive side of things. Arizona really focused on a streamlined process to let as many people try great things, to take some risks and eliminate those risks quickly so that way they can replicate great things going on for kids. So later in the interview, the Lisa and team talk about how, the quality versus quantity divide really is a false dichotomy, that Arizona proved that you can do both at once and get to scale and get to good quality.
And I love that part of the story. I know we look at Arizona today and we think, my goodness, there's so many charters there, but it's really important to understand the mindset and the entrepreneurial mindset of the leaders who set those charter laws up so that we're able to offer those opportunities to students in that state today.
I want to double down on what you guys just said and maybe use a little more colorful language that was used at the time. Arizona's leadership made a decision, a mindset, if you will, that they were going to let 1,000 flowers bloom, that they didn't know the exact best way and they weren't going to try and control everything so nothing went wrong. Other states said, well, we're going to take a real quality approach. We're going to have each school be perfect. And so you really had two competing philosophies: the go slow, make it perfect, or hey, let's let people try and we'll correct along the way.
All right, friends, we're going to take a journey south, close to where I am. We're going to head over to North Carolina, and we're going to hear from then Speaker of the House, Harold Brubaker. Let's take a listen.
Not only have we, those of us serving in the public bodies, have heard from our school districts year after year that all we need is more money. Well, what about the quality of the student? And I believe in the public school system. And so this was a very novel issue to still have a public school called a charter school that was a little different and had more leeway in how they could govern. And so that was a very interesting concept in my approach. I used to kind of like to dig back into the archives and find out what worked and what didn't work. And also, I love people that think outside the box. And of course, you did that with the original charter school movement back in the early 90s. So that's kind of the background of how I kind of got honed onto the issue of charter schools. And then we had members in after the 94 election, 95 and 96 and 97 that were all gung-ho for charter schools. And that's kind of the genesis that started the movement in North Carolina.
Now, you then were elected the Speaker of the House at that time, so you probably weren't interested in sponsoring many bills when you're in that leadership position. So other people sponsored the bill, but you were involved. But just go ahead and tell me a little bit about the history about how this happened, because you had a Democratic, Senate and a
Yes.
Democratic governor,
Correct.
Republican House. And it was very much a mixed legislature. So how did you get it through all of that?
Well, first, after 94 elections and having the first Republican majority in 100 years. As a matter of fact, it was 1895, the last time there was a Republican speaker in North Carolina until 1995. Now, since then, we've had two more and three more that served in that capacity. So one of the initial ideas, we had what we called Contract with North Carolina in 94 campaign. And one of them was talking about vouchers and charter schools. And all of a sudden, the debate opened up and we started doing legislation in the House, a number of other issues, going through our, you might say, our plan for North Carolina. And then all of a sudden, the governor and the Senate started looking at what are these guys and gals doing in the House. And we had a voucher bill introduced and a charter school bill introduced. And at that time, a friend of mine walked in one day and had a book written by Governor Wild of Massachusetts. And she said, you need to read this chapter. And in that chapter, it talked how Governor Wild in Massachusetts had a voucher bill and a charter bill. And as folks got very upset with the voucher approach, they kind of jumped on the charter approach. And I thought that was a very novel idea. So we kind of turned up the flames in North Carolina that we got to go with vouchers. And all of a sudden, all the naysayers, both the House and Senate and governor, jumped on this idea of charter schools. So that was very helpful in getting the background. And that's why the bill legislation moved very quickly through the House at that time. But that's kind of our background here in North Carolina.
So you actually created pressure by proposing vouchers in North Carolina. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly correct. Exactly correct. And that led to everybody jumping on board, saying, "Oh no, we can't have vouchers." But this charter school is a novel idea, and we need to support that. And as a matter of fact, later on, President Clinton visited North Carolina in a joint session of the House and Senate, talking about charter schools after we passed the legislation.
All right. So that's another interesting take that I'm excited to dive in. And governor at that time was Democratic Governor Jim Hunt. From my understanding, that was very popular and maybe even the longest serving governor in North Carolina. So the executive setup was really unique, as is called out in this clip. Can you all describe the North Carolina environment in more context and color?
Governor Hunt was the state's longest serving governor in North Carolina and very popular and very much a champion for public education. And that's part of his legacy, is what he's done for public education, especially around early childhood, universal preschool, teacher salaries, and charter schools are part of that as well. One of the things that's just fascinating about North Carolina in the 1990s, and it's fascinating because it's so different than how we think of governors in states today. Governor Hunt did not have the ability to veto a law. So a bill became a law once it was passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate and signed by the Speaker and the Senate President, and it became law. So Governor Hunt, he had a great big microphone. He had a bully pulpit. He could try to influence things politically. But in terms of advancing a legislative agenda, he didn't have the same power that we typically think of as governors having. So this was much more of a legislative process in North Carolina than we might have seen in other states, like in Michigan or Florida or others, where the executive was more directly involved in it. And Vashanta, within that legislative process, one thing that stood out to me, the electoral side of it too, because Speaker Brubaker talked about what he had called the contract with North Carolina at the time. So that's really a state level mirroring of the contract with America that Speaker Newt Gingrich had and helped win the 1994 elections nationally to solidify Republican control of the House of Representatives. So we see some of the echoing of national politics on the local stage and how his advancement of the charter school bill was really advancing a promise that he and his colleagues had made to the electors at that time.
Don, I want to just connect a few dots here. Remember, the speaker talked about, hey, we talked to districts and all they wanted was more money. Well, that actually goes back to the nation at risk and what came after it and led to Ted Coldry writing the article, "The States Must Withdraw the Exclusive." Because what Coldry said is the lawmakers were trying to provide rewards, incentives, threats, right? Bully pulpits. But the answer was always more money, more money, more money. And it wasn't that the states were against public education. It was just like, hey, we need better, not just more money. And that's the impetus for this type of change. And so that was the idea of going beyond the box of the district world and creating this new sector of public education called the charter public school.
And I'd like to talk about one of the very interesting strategies that I heard the speaker talk about. So it seems like it was a common theme that some of the policy ideas really aimed at giving parents more choice at that time often included vouchers. Vouchers were often a part of those conversations, but in many ways, they were really the kind of impetus to set up the stage for the legislators to actually pass charter laws. Can you all talk about how that dynamic unfolded in North Carolina and the role vouchers played for shaping the path of charters?
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that because the history of vouchers, school choice, and chartering is fairly commingled. Vouchers were not a new idea in the 90s. Vouchers had their intellectual origins with Milton Friedman in the 1950s, and then were advanced by other thinkers as ways to help historically underserved families in urban areas access better education. It was something that President Reagan had wanted to promote nationally. It was something in President Bush's reelection platform. In 1992 in California, there was a statewide voucher initiative that was unsuccessful. So vouchers was something that was discussed at a policy level nationally in a bunch of states. And as the speaker shared, in Massachusetts just a few years before, Governor Bill Weld was very successful in advancing a charter law by positioning vouchers as the alternative. So, vouchers, think of it as a way for parents to get an education of their choice by leaving the public system. That starts making charters much more appealing because charters are within the public system and within those public guardrails, um, and supervised by public bodies on things. So by the speaker advancing a voucher bill, he really framed the issue around charters very nicely. That choice should be created in North Carolina for families, and he gave two options. So the options were no longer choice or the status quo. The options were, are we going to have choice outside of the public system or inside of the public system? And that really helped drive people toward that third way, as Bill Clinton called it, of chartering.
Don, part of what is key to what you're saying too is that national context you described before, right? You had dynamics going on in states, but you also had a national campaign, right? Bush won versus candidate Clinton. And Clinton became and showed a path forward on charters. What's interesting is Clinton came as president to a joint session of the Michigan legislature with Governor Engler. You also heard in that clip, he did a similar thing in North Carolina after the charter law passed. But I also want to link that to the power of not just people, but the power of ideas in books. That they took a book and said, read this, that came from Governor Weld in Massachusetts, who played an important role in Massachusetts charter and education success story. It's the power of ideas and how that showed people there was a third way via charters.
Now, I have another question that intrigues me about these stories. And in many of these cases, we see some underlying financials at play. So in what ways are budget pressures and various funding models influencing the decision to place or lift things like charter caps?
Oh, sure. Great question. And in public education, everybody's in public education because they care about the kids. They've got big hearts to do great things for kids, but there is an economic reality of the way public education is funded too. So as choice increases within the public system and outside of the public system, and as dollars are connected to where students go, if kids aren't going to your school district and are going to a charter someplace else, that just means your district has less resources. And that has an economic impact and it has a programmatic impact on things. So North Carolina was a state whose charter law originally had a cap on it. It was a cap of 100 schools. And as the speaker discusses later in the interview, that cap was just a pure compromise. It was not a magic number. It was the product of just legislative compromise between the House and the Senate to get some choice in, but also provide not so much choice that it might have been too disruptive to the public system.
Don, great insights. I also think part of the story is windows of opportunity. So Brubaker talked about he was the first Republican speaker in 100 years. When those windows of opportunity come available, you've got to be ready to act. And how do you do that with, at the time, a Democratic governor and Democratic Senate? Well, they found a way. And part of that was being in the arena of ideas and being able to show different options and coalesce around one that you could agree on in a bipartisan way. That's the characteristic of policy entrepreneurs. They build coalitions.
We build coalitions and they compromise too to get some proof points that their idea can work, and then steward the idea, nurture it, put the systems in place for it to be able to grow, and then come back and help get it expanded and grow. And in this instance, to help more kids. And that's what happened in North Carolina. In 2011, the cap was lifted, and a lot of the pioneers who were involved were able to start growing to expand and serve more kids there.
Well, and let's go back to Ember's book, Zero Chance of Passage. Like, when you got zero chance of something, you kind of take what you can get. Does that mean you're a sellout and you compromised, or does that mean you got your foothold in and now you can expand it and grow it and perfect it? That's part of the evolution of chartering across the states. And it's certainly North Carolina's story. It's certainly Michigan's story. It's certainly Arizona's story. Where their law started, it didn't stop. You had people that were committed and stayed with it and made things happen and expanded caps, expanded choice. And when you look at the number of kids and the percentage of kids attending charter public schools today, they made it work.
Mm-hmm. And we've started kind of scratching the surface on this next question. And it's really about the unique characteristics within the North Carolina charter law. Are there other elements that we should highlight for our listeners?
Something a little different in North Carolina than some other states was the state board was the authorizing body.
And the only authorizing body.
Exactly. So, and I think the speaker discusses later in his interview that that was by design, because if it was left to the school districts, charters just wouldn't get off the ground. So by having a state level body that was involved in public education, being involved in authorizing, it allowed for the charter community to actually open up and start growing. And I think that's a real important lesson, and something that we've seen in other state laws, is that if we want laws to be effective, we've got to think about who's responsible for implementing them and their capacity and their commitment to the law itself. And in North Carolina, the state board was the choice to be able to put that into action, and continues to do so today.
I think the other thing is when you pass these laws, you probably have in the back of your mind, will anybody come forward and actually want to start a school? And part of the North Carolina story is, yeah, there was a whole bunch of people that wanted to come forward and start a school.
That's beautiful. Well, let's take a breath here and a moment of reflection. We've just heard from leaders who did not wait for perfect conditions. They acted because something had to change. And so whether it was Lisa Graham Keegan and the coalition in Arizona creating new pathways, or if we were in North Carolina with then Speaker of the House Harold Brubaker navigating various political pushbacks, they each believe that kids deserved better and they wanted to do something about that. And so I encourage our listeners to take a moment in this reflection and think, what's a bold move you can make in your role today? What's a system or an assumption that you've accepted that might be time for rethinking or reimagining? What do you need to bring to the table next, or even who? So maybe there's someone that may not always agree with you, but that grappling could actually help new ideas emerge and get started. Because change doesn't always start with a law. Sometimes it can start with a question or a conversation or a choice.
But Shanta, that's why we're bold by choice. Because you got to choose to be bold. And sometimes when you're bold, you've got to have the courage, but you also got to have dreams, conviction, a vision. And that's what these stories are. We talked about founders and multiple policy entrepreneurs who had a vision, they had a North Star, there's a better way for kids and educators, and they were determined to keep at it until they made some breakthroughs. And now you can see the success stories of both Arizona and North Carolina. I think the second thing is that they were stewards of possibility. They didn't know exactly what could happen. They didn't know exactly how it was going to unfold. They didn't have the detailed plan. What they did is they created the conditions that could evolve and grow and nurture success. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of Hayek's book, or Hayek's book, The One Best System. And let me say that over. I think that's one of the warnings of the book, The One Best System. It's the idea that there is only one way, there is only one model. They did not take that approach. They created the conditions where things could be tried, they could learn and iterate. And for our audience, whether you're running a school, you're working in an authorizer, or you're a policymaker, that's a really important point, that you're not legislating a mandate, you're creating conditions. What we used to call in those early days, enabling legislation that allowed people to try things.
Mm-hmm.
I think the last thing I'd say is, at the time you had governors competing, and governors compete today. Next year in 2026, I believe there's 36 or 38 governor elections, gubernatorial elections. And they're going to be out making campaigns and stump speeches, etc. Well, what are they going to be talking about? And at the time, a lot of them were trying to be the smart state, right? The education governors. We're going to attract talent. We're going to improve choice. We're going to strengthen our educational outcomes. We're going to have better accountability systems. Well, why? That leads to stronger families. It leads to stronger workforce development. It leads to stronger states. So think about, how do you help people running for office have talking points and a vision about what's going to make education work better for kids and families?
And I want to highlight for our listeners, these are samples of stories from our oral histories. Those oral histories in full context can be located in the Founders Library. So we encourage you to head on over to founderslibrary.org and listen to these full stories so that you can really grapple with how each of these states approached passing their charter laws. Well, that's it for today's episode of Bold by Choice. Next up, we'll be shifting gears just a little bit to bring in some real talk about the role of authorizers and how authorizing really began to take shape. Because let's be honest, the charter story hasn't always been told accurately, and we're excited to share more about those details. We've got to tell our own story in our own words. If you haven't committed to this journey yet, we encourage you to hit subscribe, follow us, leave us a review. We really want to know how this is resonating in the field. Until then, stay grounded and stay bold. And remember, every change we need starts with a choice. We'll see you all next week.